Welcome to Decision Vision, a podcast series focusing on critical business decisions. Brought to you by Brady Ware & Company. Brady Ware is a regional, full-service accounting and advisory firm that helps businesses and entrepreneurs make visions a reality.
Welcome to Decision Vision, a podcast giving you, the listener, clear vision to make great decisions. In each episode, we discuss the process of decision-making on a different topic from the business owner's or executive's perspective. We aren't necessarily telling you what to do, but we can put you in a position to make an informed decision on your own and understand when you might need help along the way. My name is Mike Blake, and I'm your host for today's program. I'm a director at Brady Ware & Company, a full-service accounting firm based in Dayton, Ohio, with offices in Dayton, Columbus, Ohio, Richmond, Indiana, and Alpharetta, Georgia. My practice specializes in providing fact-based strategic risk management advice to clients that are buying, selling, or growing the value of companies and their intellectual property. Brady Ware is sponsoring this podcast, which is being recorded in Atlanta per social distancing protocols. If you would like to engage with me on social media with my chart of the day and other content, I'm on LinkedIn as myself and at Unblakeable on Facebook, Twitter, Clubhouse, and Instagram. I also recently launched a new LinkedIn group called A Group That Doesn't Suck. So please join join that as well, so that if you would like to engage with me, that's your opportunity to do so. If you like this podcast, please subscribe on your favorite podcast aggregator, and please consider leaving a review of the podcast as well. Today's topic is, should I license my intellectual property? And as I look back on the history of this program, and we're now recording show number 140 something, I'm stunned that we have not covered this topic. Intellectual property is such an important facet of our economy. There's data that suggests that the value of our economy as a whole may be 90 to 95% comprised of intellectual property, certainly intangible assets. And, conversely, the world in which I at least partially live, accounting, does a terrible job of measuring the value of intellectual property. GAAP is just bad at measuring the value of intangible assets, intellectual property, which is why so-called value investors such as Warren Buffett have not really done all that well the last few years, because so much value just doesn't fall into that bucket anymore. And according to IBIS World, intellectual property licensing is a $54 billion industry in the United States. And this is a recent data point. This is actually as of their October 2021 report. Interestingly, the biggest player in this market is Disney. And the most actively licensed form of intellectual property is franchises at 39.8% of the market. But that doesn't mean there isn't a whole lot of active intellectual property licensing elsewhere. And here to join us to discuss this topic is Andrew Innes, who is a tabletop game designer based in my hometown of Boston, Massachusetts. He came up with the idea for his first game when he was 12 years old. Anomia Press, his company, publishes the award-winning and highly addictive card games Anomia and Duple, which have sold over 1 million copies and have been translated into 15 languages around the world. Now, I'm going to struggle very hard to maintain some sort of focus on this episode because I'm a gamer myself. I love games. I played Dungeons and Dragons with people last night, and I just freely admit that the nerds shall inherit the earth. So I love this, but I promise we'll get around to a business topic at some point during this podcast. Andrew, welcome to the Decision Vision podcast.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here.
So let's start. When we talk about an intellectual property license, what does that mean to you? How would you define that?
Well, I guess, it can mean a lot of things, I suppose. But I mean, in my case, it means that, I came up with this idea for a game, and initially I self-published it and was manufacturing it and distributing it myself. And then after a while, meanwhile, I was, still had a full-time job and had two young kids and, busy life. When I got an offer to license Anomia, it sort of came at a time where I was, struggling to deal with the growth of Anomia Press, and also faced with the issue of managing, selling to retailers and trying to get paid by them, and managing to have enough money to make my next batch of games. And, we grew kind of fast, so it was a little bit painful. And, I had to borrow some money, et cetera. So, in that moment for me, licensing was a nice option, because it took away a lot of the problems I had, which were like how to deal with the growth, how to deal with, selling to retailers and maintain my career at the time, and not just be like an insane person. So, I guess in a nutshell, licensing means like, putting some value on an idea you have, typically in some kind of tangible form, in the form, in this case, of a game, and then giving the rights to somebody else, another company, to manufacture and distribute that.
Now, I think there's a commonly held perception of licensing IP that it's so-called mailbox money, where you sign a licensing deal, somebody else does all the work, you put your feet up, you binge watch Game of Thrones for the third time or something, and you wait for the checks to roll in. Is that what happened to you, or did you sign a couple of licensing deals and you're just sort of living the good life and don't have to work anymore? How does that work?
Well, I did binge watch Game of Thrones, so maybe, I don't know. I mean,
okay.
I mean, your mileage may vary, I guess is the best way to put it. Like, Anomia has been very successful. And, I think, our situation may not be, anybody else's situation. It's always going to vary, So, I mean, on one hand, like, the reason that I chose to license was, like I said, I was juggling a lot of stuff, young kids, another career. And I was sort of thinking, like, well, what do I, this is something I say to people when they're considering this. I'm like, what do you want to do with your time? Like, what do you want to be spending your time on? And for me, I had this vision for Anomia. I wanted to see it grow to, multiple products, a multi-product line. And I, at the time I was still, focused on my other career. I mean, I've since left that career and I'm focused on this stuff full time, but so licensing for me in large part was about like making a decision about how I wanted to spend my days. And what I wanted to do was grow the product line. And what I didn't want to do was, chase down 25 retailers who were past due. And, I also, big part of this was my licensing partner, they had a great distribution network, and way bigger than what I had. And they had relationships with, large chain stores and big box stores and the mid-tier stores and all the mom and pop shops. And so immediately, I had already been working with them. They had been a distributor for me for I don't know how long, maybe 6 to 8 months or something like that. And then they approached me with an offer to license. So I had an existing relationship with them. But yeah, so it was all about what I wanted to spend my time doing. I mean, if you want to like grow your business from the ground up and retain full control of everything, then, licensing may not be for you. If you want to take advantage of another business's, distribution network or other, depending on, what your product is, then, it might make sense to consider licensing. So.
Now, I'm curious. You said when you licensed at first, you had another job. I'm curious what that was. It's if you're in the role-playing gaming community, for example, Gary Gygax, one of the founders of Dungeons and Dragons, was an insurance salesman until that took off enough for him. What was your primary hustle before you moved into gaming?
Sure. So, well, at the time, my last full-time job was with Harvard Business Review, and I did product development for them, mostly in the
Oh,
digital space. So I did like app development and some mobile web development, mostly like as a sort of product manager and project and product manager type role. Um, so basically finding ways to take their content and then repackage it, repurpose it in a digital context. I mean, I started there right around the time that first iPhones were coming out. So, we were getting into that. And prior to that, I had worked in publishing. I worked for a company called Source Media, which was a financial publisher in Manhattan, and I started there actually in print production, and that was kind of awesome because those skills were really helpful when I was first prototyping Anomia, like knowing my way around a desktop publishing software. But after a few years there, I worked there for about 10 years, and so I worked in print production, like putting out a daily newspaper for a few years, and then I moved over to their web group, and I was editing on, an editor on the website, and then I became a product manager there for one of their main websites. And then over time, I took on, I think I had about 5 websites that were, 2 daily papers, 2 monthly magazines, and like a weekly newspaper as well. So just doing basically, interfacing between tech development, editorial, advertising, marketing, customer service, and sort of, helping all of those different parts of the business interact with and improve the website and things like that.
So of the 2 games you have licensed, which is the one you developed first? Was it Anomia?
Yeah, so Anomia, and there's 4 currently in the market. There's 4 versions of Anomia out, but the original game was a small blue box with 2 decks, and that was the first one.
So when you developed that, how developed was that game when you started to approach potential licensees? You must have had, I guess, at least a basic prototype. Was it highly polished? Was it kind of a rough prototype just to let people know generally where you were headed? How far did you have to have that product developed before you felt like you could take it to licensees and be taken seriously?
Well, I mean, in my case, I actually had a product. Anomia was in the market, so I had worked on it for a number of years, refining it. Then I sort of did my own version this was maybe, right around the same time Kickstarter was beginning, but I did my own Kickstarter where my own version of it. Like I spammed everybody I knew and asked them to pre-purchase copies of the game. And I raised enough money to print my first print run. And then I, was able to fulfill, all the orders for the people who had pre-purchased copies. And then I, sold a bunch more right after that. But so, yeah. And then I started the sort of slow process of getting it out into stores and getting it, learning more about the toy industry. But basically, I had been sitting on this idea for so long. Like I had the idea for, Anomia when I was a kid. And then I kind of sat on the idea. I kept coming back to it over the years, and then finally I was like, maybe I should prototype this. And so I did. I started playing with friends, and then I kind of play tested it for 3 or 4 years with a lot of different people and refined it further. And then at a certain point, I was like, okay, it's done. I don't need to do any more. Like, now what? And so the first thing was I didn't want to license it right away. I wanted to bring it to market first and see what happened, and then go from there. So basically, I had a product in the market, and it was selling well. Like, I mean, we sold 1,000 games our first year, but really that was like the last 2 months of the first year. And then we sold like 20 something thousand games the following year. And it was in that year that, we were approached by, another company saying like, hey, would you consider licensing this to us? So, Now there's up and downsides to that approach. Like, one is, if you've got an idea, I mean, it's very common in the toy industry and the tabletop game industry for an inventor to come up with an idea, make a rough prototype. It doesn't need to have any, like fancy design or anything. It'd be super basic, but enough so that you can show how does the game play, what are the components of the game, etc. And then, like, part of what happens, say, at like an industry event like Toy Fair, which is our big international trade event in February in New York City, where game designers come and they've booked meetings with different companies, and they go around and they pitch their ideas to companies, and people say, oh yeah, that looks cool, I want to license that for you, or no, we're going to pass on that, it doesn't really fit our product line or whatever. So I mean, I had actually gone to Toy Fair many times with my prototype in my bag, never showed it to anyone because I was terrified somebody would like steal my idea,
Really?
So the upside of bringing your product to market first is that if you have some success, then when you're negotiating your licensing deal, you often can get a better percentage for your royalties. If you have an unproven product, like you just have this cool idea and people like the idea, but they have no idea how it does in the market, you're going to get probably more of the standard licensing, like what's standard for whatever industry you're in. So
if you even get that, and I think that's a really important point, because
if you even get that right,
the licensing, the most successful licensors I have met and worked with are ones that did bring their inventions to the market first in some fashion, proved market traction, right? Proved that they could, maybe you didn't want to, right? But at least you theoretically could bring it to the market on your own. And that gives you a lot of leverage, because you don't have to just sort of take whatever a licensee is willing to pay. You do have at least the option, even if in the back of your mind you're saying, God, I hope they take this deal because I don't want to do this anymore. Right. If you're at least a modicum of a decent poker player and you cannot show that in the negotiation, then you do have this fallback position. Okay, well, if you don't like it, I'll just keep selling it, right? And you'll just keep losing out on the income. And so, as opposed to what I think many inventors and intellectual property developers romanticize about, that you can put an idea down on a piece of paper, maybe even get something patented, trademarked, copyrighted, whatever. There's some sort of protection of something there. There's a hope that, hey, if I just go to a deep-pocketed entity with a big idea, they're just going to license it. I think that is very much the exception rather than the rule at any price.
Yeah, and also, licensing comes with some other challenges, like, when I was not licensing, when it was all under my control, for better or worse, then I was, the buck stopped with me, and also any kind of marketing, like, I had more flexibility around marketing or where I could sell, et cetera. And now, I mean, I feel lucky in my current, with my current partner, because I've actually maintained a lot of control over, creative control over packaging, and also I do all the marketing. Like they're happy, they're super happy to be like the awesome distribution channel that they are, and distributor, and like that's what they do. They're great at it, and so I've over the years taken on more of a marketing role, and basically what I do now is product development and marketing. So I'm and you may or may not be able to do that depending on your relationship with your licensor, or your licensee. Also going into it with them, I had to be really clear in my head, like they weren't going to market it. That's not their job. They're not marketing to consumers. They sell to stores. They don't sell to consumers. So, when I talk to other people, I often consult with people in the game space, because some friend of a friend is like, oh, my friend made a game, like what should they do next? And so I often will meet with folks like that. And I am always upfront about that. Like, if you license your game to another company, depending on the company and their approach, some game companies do market to consumers. They do have a social media presence. They do, this and they do that, but some don't. And so you have to consider, and also know that, like, my licensee, they distribute, for Hasbro and for Mattel. Like, my product is like one of thousands, it's one of thousands of other products. Like, and, they love the game and all that, but like, I'm not, you got to go into it with your eyes open. Like, often if a larger company is taking on your product, they have other considerations. Like, they're going to consider your product, but it's one small piece of their business, and it's not going to get the personal attention that you may feel it needs. And so you really need to make sure that you can deal with that, and maybe you can deal with that by being a marketing voice for your product. Like, I go to conventions, I exhibit at conventions, and I'm sitting there demoing games all day, to thousands of people, and I've got an email list I'm promoting to, and websites, and running contests on my website, etc. Like, I'm doing all that stuff, because no one else is going to do it. So,
and that's exactly a point I wanted to kind of tease out of you in this conversation. In that, again, I think there's a widely held view that if you license your IP, you sign a license, you start watching TV, and just let the royalty checks roll in. But the reality is that I think if you want to maximize your revenue or come close to maximizing your income from that relationship, you've got to help now your licensee be successful. You have to,
right.
You need to, if what you're good at is marketing, you need to be out there and market it, right? If you're
right.
kind of an influencer, then you need to influence, right? Whatever it is.
Whatever you can do. Yeah. I mean, again, it's going to vary from, situation to situation, and what your industry is, what your licensor is, or what your licensee is, interested in you doing. Some, it's pretty frequent that a game designer might license to a company, and then the company doesn't really want to deal with them. They don't want to deal with, listening to all of your ideas about marketing. Inventors, they've got enough to do. So
inventors can be very hard to listen to, because it's their baby, and
they're excited about their idea, and they think it's the best thing ever.
And now they've been validated with one licensing agreement, and right. it can be easy to fall into the trap then, because you have that one agreement. You now think you have 38 other awesome ideas that everybody would be a fool not to listen to.
Right. Exactly.
And And so the point is you still have a business. The business model may be different, but you do still have a business when you're licensing your IP.
Yeah, I mean, it's different in terms of the day-to-day. Like, it's not the same where I was, shipping games and chasing down people for payment, and trying to do this and trying to do that. Like, it's a very different kind of business now.
So when you took your game to market and they started appearing on retail shelves, were you positioning yourself in such a way that you were hoping to attract a licensee, or did that relationship kind of happen serendipitously?
No, that was serendipitous. Like, I was distributing myself in the United States. I had been approached by a distributor in Canada, and then I had been approached by a distributor in Australia. So I had sort of set up, I was taking care of the US, and then I was working with this Canadian distributor and an Australian distributor. And then, when I set out with Phenomia, like, I think my vision was more about, like, oh, I'll sell a lot on Amazon and I'll get it into some stores. And I didn't really know what, I didn't know a ton about the toy industry. I didn't, there was a lot I didn't know. So I didn't really have any sense of I mean, I'll say it's like after, my first print run, I did 2,500 units, and I pre-sold 500 of those as for the people who helped support that first printing, and then those went out right around actually just this time in it was November 2009, and then I sold another 500 copies like between November and December, because of the holidays, like people were into the game, and some people bought it for gifts and stuff. And then in January of 2010, I had 1,500 games left, and they were sitting in my attic and right above my bedroom. And I was always worried, they'd come crashing through the floor and kill me in my sleep. And I was like, what am I going to do with all of these games? I have so many games in my attic, and I have no idea how to sell all of them. Am I going to sell them one by one? Am I going to sell them to a store? I think I had gotten it into about 3 stores. And so I really didn't know what I was going to do. Like that was like the next big problem. The first big thing was just getting the game made, and then the second big problem was, all right, I made my game. Like, what do I do now? And I mean, I knew that I had wanted to just produce it myself initially before trying to license it. So that's where I was, sitting there in January scratching my head, trying to figure out what was next. So I didn't have a big vision for it, certainly not like the vision I have for it now.
So what did that conversation look like when ultimately some licensees approached you? What kind of questions did they ask? What kind of due diligence did they go through with you?
I mean, they loved the game, so they knew the product already, and they saw, they saw an opportunity there, and they asked me, I had to provide them with details about like what I had sold, basically, how much I had sold over that time period. So that I think that was probably the bulk of their, what they wanted to know. They wanted to know, like how many units I had sold, where had I sold them, and where was I getting it printed, and that kind of thing. And yeah, so those are the kinds of questions. I mean, it was a long time ago now. So
was it your impression? How quickly did those deals come together? Do you remember?
I mean, pretty quickly. I think, we went back and forth for a few months, like, redlining the agreement. And I worked with a lawyer, and, just trying to make sure that everything was covered on our end, and that we, got the percentage that we wanted, et cetera. So
in those conversations, did the topic ever come up of potentially simply selling your IP outright?
No, not to my recollection. I mean, it's something I think about now, but again, like I have this vision for what I want the line to be, and so I'm kind of working towards realizing that. And I kind of am, I'm not really sure what, if my kids are going to be interested in this business, down the road, or they're both just, entering they're in 8th and 9th grade. So, I could imagine it would be at least 10 to 15 years before if one of them was interested, that they would, potentially get involved. But like, so I think I'm 52. So, I'm starting to think about, retirement in, 12, 13 years, and, or not. I mean, like if I can maintain this business as it is, like I could imagine doing this for quite a while past that point. But, but I am thinking about like, okay, I want to have 15 products. I want to have X number of social media followers, X number on my email list. I want to have presence in these stores around the country, and I want to translate it into, five more languages, or whatever. So I kind of think about that stuff in terms of maybe one day selling off the IP. Like I remember when I was just getting started around that time, Trivial Pursuit was sold to, I think, Hasbro for $80 million, and I was like, wow, that's kind of amazing. So yeah, it's definitely something I think about. I mean, it's also, I feel like, even though I've licensed it, it's still kind of my baby, and I feel very much like the face of the game, in terms of like the public marketing efforts. So,
now, when you negotiated the terms of these licensing deals, how difficult did you find it? You'd never negotiated a deal like this. How did you kind of come to a point where you thought the deal that was put in front of you was fair? How did you push back on certain terms? How did you know how to navigate that, or did you?
Yeah, well, I mean, I had a good lawyer, and that was very, very helpful. And I wanted to, there were certain things I wanted. Like I wanted to control, I saw already that there was an opportunity to make more versions of the game, different thematic extensions. So I wanted to make sure that I had control over things like package design, and I wanted to be able to, audit their books if I wanted to make sure that, they were really doing what they said they were doing. And I wanted to, what was the other thing that was,
what about if they weren't successful, right? Sometimes
right. Well, we had a minimum
reversionary rights.
They had to hit a minimum, based on minimum units sold annually, and then I also wanted marketing stock. I wanted to be able to have games to use for marketing purposes. So we put that into the contract. Like I get X number of games every year. And to use for marketing. So, basically for me, like having the creative control on the packaging and the product development, one thing I gave up at the time was like selling on, somewhere like Amazon, and which I understood. But I did maintain an e-commerce presence on my site, though it was fairly, it wasn't a big operation.
And I'm curious. I may be stepping out of bounds here, but I'll try to be as vague as I possibly can, because I think
Okay.
I think the answer will be potentially of interest to our listeners, and that is, are your deals straight royalty, or are there any maintenance or milestone payments involved? Is it all just based on sales, or is there any kind of fixed component to your deals?
So they're all typically based on sales. In the case of, so I've been speaking mostly about my North American licensing so far, but we do have, our games are in 15 languages, so we have licensing deals in many other countries, and often those deals are sort of prefaced with a what do you call it? There's an upfront fee which gets paid. I'm spacing on the name, and an advance. Sorry, thank you. So there's an advance, and then typically the licensee will then sell against that advance, or then you don't really make any money until they've passed that number in sales. So it's like a good faith, a token of good faith. Like, we're going to give you X amount, and then after we've sold enough games to recoup that, we'll then start paying you, quarterly or annually or whatever the deal is. So,
and how did you ensure that your intellectual property was properly protected? Is it for what you do? Is it copyrights? Is it trademarks? Is it something else?
It's copyright and trademark, basically. So,
now,
and even then, I mean, it's goofy in the game industry because, I mean, the classic example of this is apples to apples and Cards Against Humanity. Like Cards Against Humanity is apples to apples. It's the exact same game, exactly down to the nitty gritty fine details. However, the content is very different, so it can be its own game, and obviously has a very different audience and a very different, it sold, they both have sold millions of copies, but they're very different kinds of games. And similarly, now I see with Anomia, like there's two knockoffs in the market now where people have taken the idea and tweaked it slightly. And I get, it's really annoying to me, but it's also like that's just what happens, It's why there's McDonald's and Burger King and so Coke and Pepsi.
You've been licensing your games for how long now?
Licensing about 10 years.
Okay, so in that decade, what, if anything, has surprised you that you weren't expecting from your licensing relationships?
I mean, sometimes, well, I'm always really amused. Anomia is a funny name. And so in other countries, we often have to change the name of the game because they just are like, we can't deal with this name. It's weird. And so I'm always like surprised at the names that people come up with. They don't always mean anything to me because I'm not a native language speaker of whatever languages. Also, we had one licensee who wanted to change the game, in a not in a huge way, but like they wanted to add this other element to it. And, they were a big company and we let them do it because we thought, they must know what they're doing, like they're a big successful game company. And fast forward to now, like we've ended our license with them and we're looking for somebody else in that territory because the game didn't do great and I think they screwed it up, frankly. So, Anomia is a super simple, like very, elegant in its simplicity type of game. It's not a complicated game. So like adding more elements, like doesn't really do anything to the gameplay or doesn't do anything for the gameplay, I should say. And so, yeah, I'm always surprised, like, at the names that people come up with or and also, one thing that's super interesting is that like how the North American market is like the massive, juggernaut that it is. And then when you add up all the sales from all the other, languages, it's like, maybe equivalent to like what you're doing in North America, but actually probably not even half as much. It's like the North American market is just this monstrous thing. Yeah,
that makes sense. I mean, when I'm doing an intellectual property appraisal, I'll, absent specific data to the contrary, I'll often assume that there's the United States and then there's sort of the rest of the world that equals the United States market. And I've rarely, if ever, run into trouble with that assumption.
Yeah, I'd say, I couldn't really say exactly, but I don't think what we sell across the rest of the world is, dollars to dollars. Well, also our percentages are different in every territory, so it's not apples to apples, but but I should go look at that unit for unit and see how it compares. That would be pretty interesting.
Now, you touched on this a little bit, but it's such an important point. I want to come back and make it explicit, even at the risk of sounding repetitive. And that is making sure that you're paid what you're owed. When you license a property to somebody else, you're probably not gaining access to their internal accounting system. So you're having to kind of rely on the kindness of strangers, if you will, or the integrity of the licensee to report revenue correctly and pay you what you're actually owed. How do you make sure of that's true, or do you just sort of have to trust your partner and hope it works out?
I mean, I think it's a mixture of, like, we have some language in our contract that says, we can come and look at your books and see, as best as possible. I mean, not to say that if they were really devious, they could probably cook up something to show us that, but I mean, part of it is just good faith. In the case of the international licensing, it's a little bit even trickier because, we've certainly gone, 2, 3, 4 quarters without getting paid from some companies, and we have to just hound them. And, I have a person that helps me with my international licensing. So they've got, one, they know, oh, this is a good company. They're trustworthy. Like they've got the inside scoop on like who's worth working with and who's not. So like usually when I get a deal to license, then, I know going in, like, these people are worthy, because these people that I work with to help me find the international licenses, like the game industry and toy industry it's a huge industry, but it's also like, it's like everybody knows everybody, so
especially in gaming.
Yeah, in gaming. So you can, as long as you have like I wouldn't be able to do necessarily all these international deals without the folks that basically they're like sales reps for me. Like they go and they find and help me maintain those relationships. So they're plugged into that whole international network.
So are your licenses exclusive? And is that what the licensees ultimately wanted, or did you think about multi-exclusivity? What's your exclusivity situation like?
They're typically exclusive. Like in Europe, it's a little funny because, like, if you make the German version, then you can sell that across Europe. It's not like you can only sell it in Germany, but you can only sell the German version. You can't go make a French version and sell that across Europe too. Like that's for the French licensee. So typically they're exclusive in a given territory, in a specific territory, and yeah.
Okay.
So.
Now, have you ever had any kind of dispute with any of your licensees where it got serious?
Nothing too bad. We've had some some kind of gray area stuff where like one company kind of got into bed with another company, and then it wasn't clear, like, were we still with them or were we with this new company, like stuff like that. But nothing's gotten particularly bad.
Okay.
Mostly, yeah. It's been
and what about the length of your licenses? Do they have a finite length? Do they have automatic renewal? Are they just perpetual? How does the time frame of your licenses work?
They typically they're all different, but they often have some kind of like either a time a time frame in which we'll reconsider the license. I mean, always my approach with this stuff is to give a lot of benefit of the doubt to the business, because they know their market and they know. So like if they want to, if things are going well, like I'm probably going to stay with them, even if like, oh, you missed your numbers by 1,000 units, but I'm probably still going to stay with you at least for another term, so that you have a chance to, I'm not going to pull the plug on someone because they didn't sell all their units in like during COVID or something,
Right.
Sure. there's like reality, so there's ups and there's downs. So, but typically, there's either a number, like got to hit this many units, and year over year, if you're really not hitting your numbers, then okay, we'll move on. But we'll work with you and give you that chance.
We're talking with Andrew Innes, and the topic is, should I license my intellectual property? This probably doesn't apply to you, but on the other hand, they still have to have instructions on the side of a can of paint that you shouldn't drink paint. So I guess I shouldn't assume anything. Are there any issues of liability in terms of, somehow somebody, I don't know, injures themselves with a card cut or something? It's probably standard boilerplate, but
not so far. I mean, you have to get your products tested in the toy industry, especially if they're being manufactured elsewhere.
Right.
Make sure there's no lead. Make sure if they're small parts, it's got to have labels for little kids, and there's all that stuff. So all that stuff's got to happen, and all the licensees have to do it. So.
And who's responsible for that? Do you do that, or does the licensee do that? That testing.
The licensee typically does it, though. Excuse me, I got a phone ringing in the background. The licensee typically does it for their territory. So.
Okay. And do your licensees have the right to sublicense if they find somebody else that wants to license to them? Can they do that, or do all new licensees have to come to you as kind of the mothership?
Yeah, no, there's no sublicensing.
Okay. Andrew, we're getting to the end of our time, and I want to be respectful of your time because I know you've got more games to develop. They're going to be awesome.
Coming into the fourth quarter.
We probably have not covered everything that a listener would have wanted, or maybe we didn't go into as much depth as they would have liked. If somebody wants to contact you, maybe for a little bit of additional advice to follow up after this podcast, would you be willing to talk to help them? And if so, what's the best way for them to contact you?
Yeah, sure. I'm always happy to talk about any of this stuff. I guess probably the best way is to just go to our website and use the contact us form. That'll come to me. And the website is anomiapress.com. It's ANOMIAP as in Paul RESS.com.
That's going to wrap it up for today's program. I'd like to thank Andrew Innes so much for sharing his expertise with us. We'll be exploring a new topic each week, so please tune in so that when you're faced with your next business decision, you have clear vision when making it. If you enjoy these podcasts, please consider leaving a review with your favorite podcast aggregator. It helps people find us so that we can help them. If you'd like to engage with me on social media with my chart of the day and other content, I am on LinkedIn as myself and at Unblakeable on Facebook, Twitter, Clubhouse, and Instagram. Also, check out my new LinkedIn group, a group that doesn't suck. Once again, this is Mike Blake. Our sponsor is Brady Ware & Company, and this has been the Decision Vision Podcast.